The notification sound was simple, just a soft ping on Detective Sarah Chen's phone at 3:47 a.m. on a cold Tuesday morning in October 2024. But what appeared on her screen would reopen one of the most haunting cold cases in Montana's history. Two missing phones, belonging to siblings who had vanished without a trace 12 years earlier, were suddenly pinging from a remote location in Glacier National Park. Before we dive into this mystery, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. Marcus and Emma Holloway had been adventure-loving siblings who lived for the outdoors. In July 2012, Marcus was 26, a software engineer who rock climbed on weekends, and Emma was 23, a photography student whose camera never left her side. Their parents still remembered the smell of coffee and bacon that last morning, as the siblings packed for a 3-day hiking trip through Glacier National Park. Emma stuffed energy bars into her backpack, excitement infectious. "We'll get incredible shots of the northern lights," she told her mother. Marcus checked his GPS twice, making sure their emergency beacon worked. The sound of zippers and boots echoed through the house as they prepared for their final adventure. Together. Their parents had watched from the front porch as Marcus's blue Honda Civic disappeared down the tree-lined street, the morning air carrying the scent of pine and the promise of rain. It was the last time anyone would see them alive, or so everyone believed for 12 long years. The initial search had been massive. Helicopters swept across jagged mountain peaks, while search dogs followed cold trails through dense forests that smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves. The sound of rescue teams calling their names had echoed through valleys for weeks, but the wilderness had swallowed the siblings completely. Their car was found 3 days later at a remote trailhead, keys still in the ignition, windows down, as if they had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. For 12 years, their phones had remained dead, silent, gone. Until that Tuesday morning, when both devices suddenly came alive, pinging from coordinates that made Detective Chen's blood run cold. The location wasn't anywhere near their planned hiking route. Instead, the signals were coming from an area locals had whispered about for generations, a section of the park where other hikers had reported strange sounds in the night, and where even experienced guides refused to venture after dark. But what really happened that night 12 years ago? And why were their phones suddenly active again, transmitting from a place they were never supposed to be? As Chen stared at the glowing coordinates on her screen, listening to the steady rhythm of rain against her window, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about two missing hikers anymore. This was about something much bigger, much darker, and much more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. Detective Sarah Chen's hands trembled as she stared at the GPS coordinates glowing on her phone screen. The numbers seemed to pulse with an otherworldly significance. 48.7596 degree N, 113.778 degree U. For 12 years, she had carried the Holloway case like a stone in her chest, the weight of unanswered questions growing heavier with each passing season. The rain outside her apartment window had intensified, drumming against the glass with an urgent rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. Chen pulled on her jacket, the familiar weight of her badge and service weapon providing little comfort, as she prepared to face a mystery that had already consumed too many sleepless nights. The drive to the park headquarters took 43 minutes through winding mountain roads slick with October rain. Her headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating glimpses of towering pines whose branches swayed like ghostly arms in the wind. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves filled her car through the slightly cracked window, a scent that always reminded her of that first search 12 years ago. Park Ranger Jake Morrison was waiting for her in the fluorescent-lit office, his weathered face etched with concern. Maps covered every surface, marked with red X's and circled areas that represented years of fruitless searching. The coffee was bitter and cold, but Chen drank it anyway, needing the caffeine to process what Morrison was telling her. The phone signals had appeared simultaneously at exactly 3:47 a.m., both devices transmitting for precisely 17 minutes, before going dark again. The location was deep in the back country, an area known locally as Devil's Throat, a narrow canyon where the wind created sounds that resembled human screaming. Even the most experienced guides avoided the area after sunset, claiming the terrain was too unstable and dangerous for overnight camping. Morrison spread a topographical map across his desk, his finger tracing the route to the signal location. The path wound through dense forest for 8 miles before descending into the canyon system. What troubled Chen most was the timing. Why would phones, that had been silent for over a decade, suddenly activate in the middle of the night? The implications sent chills down her spine. She studied the terrain photos Morrison had pulled from the park's archives. Devil's Throat appeared as a jagged scar in the earth, its walls steep and unforgiving. Shadows seemed to pool in its depths like dark water, and even in daylight photographs, the place exuded an ominous quality that made Chen's skin crawl. The ranger's radio crackled to life, breaking the heavy silence. Weather reports indicated an incoming storm system that would make any rescue or recovery operation impossible for at least 48 hours. Time was already working against them. But what if this wasn't about rescue anymore? What if someone, or something, wanted them to find what lay hidden in Devil's Throat? The Holloway family home sat unchanged at the end of Maple Street, its blue shutters faded by 12 seasons of mountain weather. Detective Chen parked beneath the same oak tree where Marcus and Emma had once hung a tire swing, its empty rope still swaying in the morning breeze like a pendulum marking lost time. David Holloway answered the door before Chen could knock, his eyes hollow with a hope that had been extinguished and rekindled too many times to count. His hair had gone completely gray since she'd last seen him, and his hands shook slightly as he led her into the living room that had become a shrine to his missing children. The house smelled of old coffee and fading memories. Photographs covered every available surface. Marcus rappelling down a cliff face, Emma crouched beside a mountain stream with her camera, both siblings laughing around a campfire with sparks, dancing toward star-filled skies. Linda Holloway sat in the corner armchair, clutching a faded hiking boot that had belonged to Emma, her fingers tracing the worn leather like prayer beads. Chen explained about the phone signals, watching as disbelief, hope, and terror played across their faces in rapid succession. The coordinates meant nothing to them. They'd never heard of Devil's Throat, had no idea why their children would have ventured so far from their planned route. The original hiking permit showed a completely different trail system, miles away from where the signals had originated. The basement held 12 years of accumulated evidence that the official investigation had missed or dismissed. David had created his own command center, complete with detailed maps, weather reports, and witness statements he'd collected independently. The walls were covered with photographs of the search area, taken from every conceivable angle and season. Some showed footprints in mud that had long since washed away. Others captured shadows between trees that might have been nothing more than tricks of light. In a manila folder marked Unexplained, Chen discovered testimonies that made her blood run cold. 3 separate hikers had reported hearing screams from the direction of Devil's Throat during the week the Holloway siblings had disappeared. All 3 accounts had been dismissed by the original investigation as wind patterns or animal sounds. Park rangers had found no evidence of human presence in the area. Linda Holloway's voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke, her words heavy with years of suppressed anguish. The night before Marcus and Emma left, she'd dreamed of them falling into darkness, their voices calling her name from somewhere far below. She'd woken with tears on her cheeks and a certainty that something terrible was going to happen. She'd begged them not to go, but they'd laughed off her concerns as maternal worry. The basement's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Chen studied, a collection of newspaper clippings David had saved. Other disappearances in Glacier National Park, dating back decades. A pattern emerged that law enforcement had never connected. Hikers who vanished near Devil's Throat, their phones and equipment never recovered, their bodies never found. How many others had vanished into that dark canyon, their families left with nothing but questions and fading hope? Dawn broke gray and cold over the park headquarters as Chen assembled her search team in the equipment shed that smelled of rope, canvas, and years of mountain rescues. Steam rose from coffee cups clutched in gloved hands while team members checked their gear with the methodical precision of people who understood that lives depended on preparation. Jake Morrison stood at the head of the group, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many searches end in heartbreak. The weather window was narrowing. They had perhaps 6 hours before the incoming storm system would make evacuation impossible. The terrain around Devil's Throat was unstable at the best of times, prone to rock slides and flash floods that could trap even experienced rescue teams. Dr. Amanda Foster, the team's technical specialist, spread her laptop across a folding table, the screen displaying satellite imagery of the target area. The canyon appeared as a dark wound in the earth, its depths invisible even to high-resolution cameras. Recent geological surveys indicated underground cave systems that had never been fully mapped, passages that could extend for miles beneath the mountain. The coordinates from the phone signals pinpointed a location roughly 2 miles into the Canyon, accessible only by rappelling down a 60-foot cliff face. Emergency communications would be limited once they descended. The canyon walls would block radio signals, leaving them isolated from the outside world until they climbed back out. Chen studied the faces of her team members, reading the mixture of determination and unease in their expressions. Search and rescue specialist Maria Santos had worked body recoveries in Devil's Throat twice before, both times emerging with stories she refused to discuss in detail. Her equipment pack was heavier than the others, containing specialized gear for cave exploration and body extraction. The drive to the trailhead took 30 minutes along increasingly rough roads that eventually became little more than tire tracks. Through dense forest, ancient pines towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked most of the pale morning light. The air grew colder as they climbed higher, carrying the scent of snow and something else, a musty odor that reminded Chen of old graves. At the canyon rim, the team paused to adjust their equipment and study the descent route. Devil's Throat yawned below them like an open mouth, its walls slick with moisture and draped with moss that seemed to writhe in the shifting light. The sound of wind through the canyon created an almost musical hum, punctuated by the occasional crack of settling rock that echoed from the depths. Morrison's radio crackled with a weather update that made everyone's stomach clench. The storm was moving faster than predicted, with heavy rain and possible snow expected within 4 hours. If they weren't back on the rim by then, they could be trapped in the canyon for days. Chen attached her rappelling gear to the anchor point, testing the ropes with sharp tugs that sent vibrations down into the darkness. The first glimpse into Devil's Throat revealed a landscape that seemed alien and hostile, where shadows moved independently of their sources, and every sound echoed back distorted and wrong. What secrets had this place kept buried for 12 long years? The descent into Devil's Throat felt like entering another world entirely. Chen's boots scraped against wet rock as she rappelled down the cliff face, her headlamp cutting through darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. The walls were covered in strange formations, not quite natural, not quite man-made, that appeared to shift and move in her peripheral vision. 60 feet below the rim, the team regrouped on a narrow ledge that barely accommodated all 5 members. The air was different here, thick and stagnant, carrying an odor of decay that made breathing uncomfortable. Morrison checked his compass and frowned. The needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north in this strange environment. The canyon floor stretched ahead like a tunnel carved by ancient waters, its walls rising in smooth curves that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Strange acoustic properties turned every footstep into multiple echoes, creating the illusion of invisible followers matching their pace. Chen's radio emitted only static when she attempted to contact headquarters. They were truly alone now. Dr. Foster's GPS readings confirmed they were moving in the right direction, though the coordinates seemed to shift slightly with each measurement. The canyon twisted and branched in ways that defied the surface topographical maps, leading them through passages that narrowed and widened without apparent pattern. Overhead, the strip of sky visible between the canyon walls had darkened to an ominous gray. 2 miles in, Santos discovered the first anomaly: scratches carved into the rock wall that appeared to be some form of primitive communication. The marks were too precise to be natural, too weathered to be recent, yet they followed patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. Foster photographed each symbol while Chen tried to shake the feeling that they were walking deeper into a trap. The phone signal coordinates led them to a circular chamber where the canyon walls opened into a natural amphitheater. Water dripped from somewhere high above, creating a constant rhythm that sounded almost like Morse code. The team's flashlights revealed dozens of small alcoves carved into the walls, each containing objects that made Chen's blood run cold. Personal belongings scattered like offerings on stone shelves, hiking boots, backpacks, cameras, and cell phones in various stages of decay. Some items appeared decades old, others much more recent. Among them, Chen recognized Marcus's distinctive red bandana and Emma's leather camera strap, items that had been described in the missing persons report 12 years ago. But these weren't the only belongings. The alcoves contained evidence of many other visitors to this place, people who had descended into Devil's Throat and never emerged. Foster's camera flash illuminated wallet after wallet, driver's licenses bearing names that would eventually match missing person reports spanning 40 years. Santos's voice cut through the heavy silence, barely above a whisper, but sharp with urgency. She'd found something else, a narrow passage leading deeper into the mountain, its entrance marked with symbols similar to those they'd seen carved in the walls. Fresh footprints in the damp earth led into the tunnel, too recent to belong to anyone from 12 years ago. The implications crashed over Chen like ice water. Someone was still coming to this place. Someone was still using these tunnels. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, they might still be here. The storm's first raindrops began falling from the narrow opening far above, landing on the team's upturned faces like tears from a weeping sky. Time was running out, but turning back now meant abandoning not just the Holloway siblings, but potentially dozens of other victims. What lay waiting in the depths beyond that narrow passage? The tunnel beyond the chamber descended at a steep angle, its walls smooth and worn as if carved by centuries of flowing water. Chen led the team single file through the passage, her headlamp revealing a pathway that seemed to have been deliberately maintained. Modern equipment, battery-powered LED lights, fresh rope anchors, and recent tool marks suggested this underground network was far from abandoned. The air grew warmer as they descended deeper into the mountain, carrying with it the sound of distant machinery that thrummed through the rock like a massive heartbeat. Dr. Foster's geological instruments detected artificial ventilation systems and electrical activity that had no business existing this far beneath the wilderness. Someone had invested considerable time and resources into making these tunnels habitable. After 20 minutes of careful navigation, the passage opened into a vast underground chamber that took Chen's breath away. Her flashlight beam disappeared into darkness that seemed to stretch beyond the reach of light itself. The cavern was enormous, large enough to house aircraft hangars, with a ceiling supported by both natural formations and clearly artificial buttresses. Along the walls, Chen could make out the entrances to dozens of other tunnels, each marked with different symbols that suggested a complex organizational system. Some passages were sealed with heavy metal doors, others gaped open like hungry mouths, leading deeper into the mountain's heart. The scale of the operation was staggering. This wasn't a natural cave system, but an engineered underground complex that had been under construction for decades. Morrison's radio crackled unexpectedly, picking up fragmented communications on emergency frequencies. The voices were distorted by the rock and distance, but Chen could make out references to subjects, extraction protocols, and containment procedures. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They weren't exploring abandoned tunnels, but an active facility with people who were very much alive and aware of their presence. Santos discovered the first evidence of recent habitation near the U. Chambers Center, a work area equipped with modern computers, communication equipment, and detailed maps of the park's underground systems. Folders scattered across metal tables contained photographs and personal information about dozens of missing hikers, including detailed profiles of Marcus and Emma Holloway. The documents were organized with military precision, suggesting this wasn't the work of a single individual, but an entire organization. The computers were still warm, their screens showing surveillance feeds from cameras positioned throughout the tunnel network. Chen watched in horror as the monitors displayed real-time footage of her own team exploring the chamber, captured from angles that proved they'd been observed since the moment they entered Devil's Throat. Other screens showed different areas of the complex: laboratory spaces, holding cells, and what appeared to be medical facilities. Foster's hands shook as she photographed documents that revealed the true scope of the operation. The missing hikers hadn't simply vanished. They'd been deliberately taken, transported to this underground facility for purposes that the paperwork described in clinical, sanitized language that made Chen's stomach turn. References to psychological conditioning, behavioral modification, and long-term observation protocols painted a picture of systematic human experimentation. A new sound echoed through the chamber, the mechanical hum of an elevator descending from somewhere high above. The team gathered their equipment and took defensive positions as footsteps approached from one of the sealed passages. Multiple voices could be heard discussing containment breach and security protocols with the calm efficiency of people who had dealt with similar situations before. Chen's radio suddenly came to life with crystal clarity, carrying a message that turned her blood to ice water. A voice, cold and professional, spoke directly to her team with intimate knowledge of their names, backgrounds, and current situation. The speaker knew exactly who they were and why they had come, and made it clear that leaving Devil's Throat would not be as simple as climbing back up the rope. How long had this organization been operating beneath the park? And how many people knew about their activities? The elevator doors opened with a soft pneumatic hiss, releasing 3 figures in white lab coats whose faces Chen couldn't quite make out in the shifting light. They moved with the practiced efficiency of medical professionals, carrying clipboards and electronic tablets that glowed blue in the cavern's darkness. Their leader, a woman with silver hair pulled back severely, approached the search team with the calm confidence of someone completely in control of the situation. She introduced herself simply as Dr. Vance, speaking with the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news to family members. The underground facility, she explained, was a private research installation dedicated to studying extreme psychological stress responses in controlled environments. The missing hikers hadn't died. They had become volunteer subjects in groundbreaking studies of human adaptation and survival instincts. Chen's hand moved instinctively toward her weapon, but Dr. Vance's next words froze her in place. Marcus and Emma Holloway were alive, healthy, and had been participating in the research program. For 12 years, their phone signals had been reactivated as part of a planned expansion of the study parameters, designed to observe how their families would respond to renewed hope after years of grief. The team followed Dr. Vance through a series of corridors, lined with observation windows that revealed the true horror of the facility. Behind reinforced glass, Chen glimpsed people living in elaborate artificial environments, replica mountain camps, simulated emergency shelters, and recreated survival. Scenarios where subjects performed daily routines under constant surveillance. The settings were perfect in their detail, complete with artificial weather systems and programmed wildlife sounds. Dr. Foster's scientific training warred with her moral revulsion as Vance explained the research protocols. Each subject lived in carefully controlled conditions designed to study long-term psychological adaptation to isolation and stress. The environments were periodically modified to introduce new challenges, measuring how individuals coped with changing circumstances over extended periods. Food, shelter, and social interaction were all variables in ongoing experiments. In observation, Room 7, Chen saw them. Marcus sat at a wooden table in what appeared to be a mountain cabin, methodically sharpening a knife while staring out a window that displayed a perfect projection of alpine scenery. His movements were mechanical, repetitive, suggesting years of conditioning. Emma worked at a desk nearby, organizing photographs that all showed the same mountain landscape from slightly different angles, her face vacant and focused on her endless, pointless task. Neither sibling showed any sign of recognizing that they were being observed. Their environment was so complete, so convincing, that they appeared to believe they were still on their hiking trip, trapped by some natural disaster that required them to wait indefinitely for rescue. The cabin's artificial windows showed a perpetual late afternoon light that never changed, creating a temporal prison where time had stopped 12 years ago. Dr. Vance's voice took on an almost proud quality as she described the psychological profiles her team had developed. The subjects had adapted remarkably well to their circumstances, developing complex coping mechanisms and social structures that provided valuable data about human resilience. The research would eventually benefit society by improving survival, training, and disaster response protocols. Santos's voice cut through the clinical explanation with barely controlled rage, demanding to know about the other missing people, the families who had spent years searching for loved ones who were locked away in underground laboratories. Dr. Vance's response was chillingly matter-of-fact. The subjects had voluntarily entered the facility, drawn by staged emergencies and rescue scenarios that led them away from their planned hiking routes. The storm outside had intensified, but Chen realized that weather was no longer their primary concern. The elevator that had brought Dr. Vance's team had been their only obvious exit from the facility, and it was now guarded by security personnel who had materialized from other passages. The research staff had prepared for the possibility of discovery, and the search team had walked directly into a trap designed by people who had been perfecting their techniques for decades. How many government agencies knew about this facility, And how deep did the conspiracy reach? Chen's mind raced as she studied the observation room's control panel, searching for any way to communicate with Marcus and Emma. The technology was more sophisticated than anything she'd encountered in law enforcement. Multiple screens monitored every aspect of the subject's vital signs, stress responses, and behavioral patterns. 12 years of data had been meticulously recorded, creating psychological profiles of unprecedented depth and detail. Dr. Vance continued her clinical narrative, explaining how each subject's environment was carefully calibrated to their individual psychology. Marcus's cabin scenario played to his protective instincts and practical nature, giving him tasks that made him feel useful while keeping him isolated from any real-world contact. Emma's photography assignment satisfied her artistic drives while ensuring she remained focused on documenting an artificial landscape that would never change. The facility's security team had positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the chamber, but their posture suggested they were more concerned with containment than immediate violence. These weren't military personnel. They moved with the careful precision of medical staff accustomed to managing unstable patients. Their weapons remained holstered, though Chen noticed the sedative injectors and restraint equipment they carried openly. Foster discovered the communication system's override controls while pretending to examine the monitoring equipment. A single switch could activate the facility's emergency protocols, flooding all subject areas with bright light and alarm sounds designed to simulate natural disasters. The chaos would be temporary, but it might provide enough confusion for Chen's team to attempt contact with the Holloway siblings. The moral implications of the decision tore at Chen's conscience. Breaking Marcus and Emma's artificial reality might cause severe psychological trauma after 12 years of carefully maintained illusion. But leaving them trapped in their simulated prison felt equally wrong, especially knowing that their parents continued to grieve for children who were very much alive just miles from their family home. Morrison's tactical experience proved valuable as he quietly assessed escape routes and potential defensive positions. The facility's layout favored the research staff, who knew every passage and security measure. But the complex was also vulnerable to disruption. The underground location meant that any structural damage could trap everyone inside, including the subjects the staff claimed to be protecting. Santos's anger had crystallized into cold determination as she watched Emma through the observation window, recognizing the subtle signs of institutionalization that came from years of controlled captivity. The young woman's movements had become ritualized, her facial expressions limited to a narrow range that suggested emotional numbing. Whatever adaptation Dr. Vance claimed to be studying, it had come at the cost of Emma's authentic personality. The storm above ground provided both opportunity and danger. The facility's power systems relied partially on surface generators that would be vulnerable to the weather, but the same conditions that might cause electrical failures would also make emergency evacuation impossible. Chen realized that Dr. Vance had deliberately timed their discovery to coincide with the storm, ensuring that any rescue attempts would be delayed for days. Through the observation windows, Chen watched Marcus suddenly stop his repetitive knife sharpening and look directly at the camera. For just a moment, his expression showed a flicker of awareness that hadn't been there before, as if some part of his consciousness was fighting against the conditioning. Emma, too, had paused in her endless photograph sorting, her hand frozen over an image as confusion crossed her features. Dr. Vance's confident demeanor cracked slightly as she noticed the subject's behavioral changes. The facility's psychological controls weren't as complete as she had claimed, and the presence of outside observers was somehow affecting the delicate balance of the artificial environments. Alarms began sounding in the monitoring station as stress indicators spiked across multiple subject rooms. The moment for decision had arrived. Chen's finger hovered over the emergency protocol switch while security personnel moved closer, their body language shifting from passive observation to active threat response. Would breaking the illusion save Marcus and Emma? Or destroy what remained of their sanity after 12 years in captivity? Chen's finger slammed down on the emergency switch with decisive force. Instantly, the underground facility erupted into controlled chaos as every artificial environment flooded with harsh fluorescent light and piercing alarm sounds. The carefully maintained illusions shattered like glass, revealing the sterile walls and mechanical systems that had created 12 years of false reality. Through the observation windows, she watched Marcus and Emma's reactions with a mixture of hope and terror. Marcus dropped the knife he'd been sharpening and stumbled backward, his eyes wide with confusion as the mountain cabin around him flickered and revealed itself to be an elaborate stage set. Emma screamed, the first genuine emotional response Chen had witnessed, as her photography workspace dissolved into exposed wiring and projection equipment. Dr. Vance's professional composure finally cracked as monitoring systems throughout the facility registered catastrophic psychological stress responses. Subject after subject was experiencing acute reality dissociation as their artificial worlds collapsed simultaneously. Years of careful conditioning unraveled in minutes, leaving dozens of people staring at the technological prison walls that had confined them for so long. The security team moved into action, but their medical training worked against them in the chaos. Instead of advancing aggressively, they moved to sedate subjects who were experiencing psychological breaks, leaving Chen's team temporarily free to act. Morrison and Santos worked together to override the observation room locks while Foster documented everything with her camera, preserving evidence of the facility's true purpose. Marcus was the first to notice the observation window, his eyes focusing on Chen's face with a recognition that sent chills down her spine. His mouth moved silently, forming words that looked like "help us" before facility staff entered his chamber, with sedatives and restraints. The brief moment of eye contact conveyed 12 years of trapped consciousness, struggling to break free from programmed responses. Emma's reaction was more violent, attacking the projection equipment in her cell, with desperate fury while screaming for her parents. The sound of her voice, raw, terrified, but unmistakably human, echoed through the monitoring station's speakers like a knife to Chen's heart. This young woman had spent over a decade in a psychological cage, her artistic soul crushed beneath layers of artificial routine and manufactured purpose. The facility's main computer systems began displaying cascade failures as the emergency protocols overwhelmed the delicate balance of environmental controls. Ventilation systems stuttered, lighting flickered, and the background hum of machinery that had maintained the illusions began to wind down with mechanical gasps. Dr. Vance barked orders to her staff while trying to manually override the shutdown procedures. Foster's technical expertise proved invaluable as she hacked into the facility's communication systems, broadcasting an emergency signal to the surface that would alert Morrison's backup teams to their location. The message included GPS coordinates, facility schematics, and video evidence of the human experimentation that had been conducted beneath Glacier National Park for decades. Through the chaos, Chen began to understand the true scope of the conspiracy. Wall displays showed connections to government agencies, military contractors, and academic institutions that had funded and supported the research. The missing hikers hadn't been random victims. They had been specifically selected based on psychological profiles that made them ideal subjects for long-term isolation studies. The storm above ground seemed to respond to the underground turmoil, with thunder crashes that shook dust from the chamber ceiling and caused several monitors to spark and fail. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows while Backup generators struggled to maintain power to the most critical systems. The facility was beginning to fail, and everyone inside, subjects, staff, and rescue team alike, faced the possibility of being trapped in a collapsing underground complex. Dr. Vance's voice cut through the alarm sounds, cold and desperate, as she made a final attempt to maintain control. Her words revealed the ultimate truth that Chen had been dreading. The facility wasn't operating independently, but as part of a network of similar installations throughout the country's national parks. How many other families were mourning loved ones who were actually locked away in underground laboratories? And would anyone survive long enough to expose the full extent of the conspiracy? Dr. Vance's revelation hit Chen like a physical blow, as the facility's main display screens flickered to life, showing real-time feeds from similar installations across the country. Yellowstone, Yosemite, the Great Smoky Mountains. Dozens of underground complexes housed thousands of missing people who had vanished during hiking trips, camping adventures, and wilderness excursions over the past 50 years. The scope of the operation was staggering. Each facility specialized in different aspects of human psychological research, from isolation studies to group dynamics, from stress response to behavioral modification. The missing persons database that Foster had accessed showed a horrifying pattern. People hadn't simply disappeared, they had been systematically harvested from America's most remote wilderness areas for use in a decades-long human experimentation program. Morrison's radio crackled with incoming transmissions from the surface as backup rescue teams responded to Foster's emergency broadcast. But the conversations Chen overheard suggested that not everyone on the outside was surprised by their discovery. Government agencies were mobilizing with suspicious efficiency, as if contingency plans for this exact scenario had been prepared years in advance. The facility's structural integrity continued deteriorating as power systems failed, and emergency protocols overwhelmed aging equipment. Water began seeping through ceiling cracks, creating pools that reflected the emergency lighting like pools of blood. The artificial environments that had housed subjects for years were collapsing into twisted metal and sparking electronics, releasing decades of recycled air that carried the scent of fear and desperation. Marcus and Emma remained separated from the rescue team by reinforced security doors that required electronic access codes Dr. Vance refused to provide. Through the observation windows, Chen could see both siblings attempting to process their shattered reality, while facility medical staff administered sedatives to keep them manageable. Their eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of minds trying to reconcile 12 years of false memories with the horror of their true situation. Santos discovered personnel files that revealed the research staff's backgrounds. Many were respected academics and medical professionals who had gradually become complicit in the experiments through a combination of scientific curiosity, financial incentives, and legal immunity provided by classified government contracts. The facility operated under the authority of agencies so secretive that their existence was known only to the highest levels of national security. The underground complex's communication systems revealed ongoing coordination between Dr. Vance and supervisors at other installations. Conversations discussed containment protocols and narrative management strategies designed to discredit any evidence that might emerge from Devil's Throat. Chen realized that even if they escaped the E2ID, conspiracy had resources and influence that could bury the truth along with anyone who tried to expose it. Foster's laptop displayed financial records showing funding sources that traced back to defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, and university research departments that had been conducting human experiments under the cover of wilderness safety studies. The missing persons had provided test subjects for research into everything from psychological warfare techniques to pharmaceutical trials for drugs that were never intended for public release. Emergency evacuation procedures were finally initiated as the facility's main power grid suffered a catastrophic failure. Blast doors began sealing automatically, designed to contain any evidence of the installation's existence should it ever be discovered. Dr. Vance and her staff moved with practiced efficiency toward evacuation routes that had been prepared for exactly this situation, leaving the subjects behind to face whatever structural collapse might follow. Chen faced an agonizing choice as the facility's automated systems began their final shutdown sequence. The evacuation tunnels could provide escape for her team, but reaching Marcus and Emma would require staying behind in a complex that was systematically destroying itself. The backup generators had perhaps 20 minutes of power remaining before the underground installation became a tomb for everyone inside. The sound of approaching helicopters echoed down from the surface, but Chen couldn't tell if they carried rescue teams or government agents sent to ensure the facility's secrets died with its occupants. Dr. Vance's final words before disappearing into the evacuation tunnel suggested that some truths were too dangerous to survive, and that the missing persons of Devil's Throat would remain missing forever. What price would Chen and her team pay for uncovering a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government? Chen made her decision in the span of a heartbeat, her voice cutting through the facility's dying mechanical sounds with absolute certainty. "We're not leaving without them." Morrison and Santos exchanged glances that spoke of shared understanding. They had all seen too many searches end in failure to abandon living victims now. Foster's fingers flew across her keyboard as she attempted to override the security locks that separated them from the Holloway siblings, while emergency lighting cast dancing shadows across walls that seemed to pulse with the facility's failing heartbeat. The sound of explosions echoed from deeper within the complex as automated destruction protocols eliminated sensitive equipment and research data. Dr. Vance's evacuation hadn't been a retreat. It had been the trigger for a systematic erasure of everything that could prove the facility's existence. Decades of human experimentation were being incinerated in controlled fires that filled the air with acrid smoke and the metallic taste of burned electronics. Foster's override attempts finally succeeded with a series of electronic clicks that seemed impossibly loud in the failing facility. Security doors throughout the observation area began opening, releasing subjects who stumbled into the corridors with expressions of complete disorientation. Some had been captive for so long that they couldn't walk properly, their muscles atrophied from years of controlled movement within artificial environments. Marcus emerged from his chamber like a man awakening from a nightmare, his eyes scanning the industrial walls and flickering lights with growing comprehension. When he saw Chen's rescue team, his legs gave way entirely, and Morrison caught him as 12 years of suppressed emotion finally broke through the psychological conditioning. His voice, unused to genuine conversation, cracked as he whispered Emma's name. Emma's cell door opened to reveal a young woman who appeared to have aged decades in minutes. The collapse of her artificial photography studio had triggered a complete psychological break, leaving her rocking in the corner while clutching fragments of fake mountain scenery. Santos approached her with the careful movements of someone dealing with a trauma victim, speaking in soft tones that gradually penetrated Emma's catatonic state. The facility's structural collapse accelerated as water from the storm above began penetrating deeper levels, creating electrical shorts that sent sparks cascading across metal walkways. The evacuation route Dr. Vance had used was now blocked by debris, leaving only the original tunnel system that had brought Chen's team into Devil's Throat. The climb back to the surface would be treacherous under the best circumstances. With traumatized civilians, it might be impossible. Morrison's radio finally achieved contact with the surface teams, but the voices that responded weren't the rescue personnel he expected. Military units were establishing a perimeter around Devil's Throat, ostensibly for safety reasons, but their communications suggested they were more concerned with containment than rescue. The facility's destruction was proceeding according to predetermined protocols that left little room for survivor evacuation. Foster's laptop displayed satellite feeds showing the true extent of the government response. Multiple agencies were converging on Glacier National Park, with resources that suggested this scenario had been war-gamed extensively. Media blackouts were already in effect, and the official story being prepared blamed the underground activity on domestic terrorists who had been eliminated during the facility's collapse. Chen's team moved through corridors filled with smoke and the sounds of other subjects calling for help in languages and dialects that represented decades of missing persons from across the country. The scale of human suffering they encountered was overwhelming. People who had been taken from their families and systematically broken down by years of psychological manipulation designed to study the limits of human endurance. The climb toward the surface began with Marcus and Emma barely able to support their own weight, their bodies and minds struggling to function outside the controlled parameters of their captivity. Behind them, the facility's final destruction, protocols engaged with a rumble that shook the mountain itself, sealing tunnels and collapsing chambers to ensure that no evidence would survive for future investigation. Above ground, the storm had intensified to the point where rescue helicopters couldn't safely approach Devil's Throat. Even if Chen's team reached the surface, they would emerge into a wilderness controlled by agencies that viewed them as threats to national security rather than heroes who had exposed a decades-long conspiracy. Could they trust anyone in the rescue teams waiting above? Or had they simply escaped one trap only to walk into another? The rope that had carried Chen's team into Devil's Throat 12 hours earlier now served as their lifeline to a world that no longer felt safe or familiar. Marcus climbed with mechanical precision, his software engineer's mind focusing on the technical aspects of the ascent, while his deeper consciousness struggled to process 12 years of stolen life. Below him, Emma moved with the careful deliberation of someone learning to trust her own body again after a decade of controlled movement. The storm had transformed the canyon rim into a battlefield of wind and rain that made the final approach treacherous. Chen's headlamp cut through sheets of water that turned the cliff face into a waterfall, while lightning strikes illuminated a landscape that seemed alien after the sterile underground environment. The natural world felt overwhelming after hours, in artificial chambers designed to limit sensory input. Morrison reached the surface first, immediately establishing defensive positions as he surveyed the government response that had materialized around Devil's Throat. Military vehicles formed a perimeter that suggested siege rather than rescue, their occupants dressed in hazmat suits that implied concerns about biological or chemical contamination. The official story was already being constructed around the ET-BAD assumption that everyone who had entered the canyon was either dead or compromised. Foster's equipment registered electromagnetic interference that blocked most communication channels, but she managed to establish contact with news outlets using emergency protocols that bypassed the military's communication blackout. The video evidence she had collected in the facility began uploading to secure servers in multiple countries, ensuring that some record of the underground complex would survive regardless of what happened to the rescue team. Emma collapsed the moment she reached solid ground, her legs unable to support her weight, as the psychological impact of her liberation finally overcame the adrenaline that had sustained her during the climb. Santos worked to stabilize her while Marcus knelt beside his sister, speaking her name with a voice that carried 12 years of grief and hope. The reunion was heartbreaking and beautiful. Two broken people finding pieces of themselves in each other's survival. The military's approach was coordinated and professional, But Chen recognized the signs of a cover-up operation rather than a legitimate rescue response. Decontamination protocols were being implemented that would separate the survivors and control their statements, while medical personnel prepared sedatives that would ensure compliance during questioning. The truth about the facility was already being buried beneath layers of national security classifications. Chen made a final desperate call to Director Walsh, the one person in law enforcement who had supported her investigation of the Holloway case over the years. The encrypted communication revealed that Walsh had been expecting this call and that preparations had been made to protect the survivors and preserve evidence of the underground facility's existence. A network of journalists, civil rights lawyers, and international human rights organizations had been quietly briefed and were ready to act. The confrontation with military personnel was tense but brief. Chen's team was ordered to submit to decontamination and debriefing procedures, while Marcus and Emma were designated for immediate medical evacuation to facilities where their testimony could be controlled or discredited. The official explanation involved classified anti-terrorism operations that required all participants to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements backed by threats of federal prosecution. Foster's video uploads had completed just moments before her equipment was confiscated, ensuring that evidence of the underground experiments had reached media outlets in Europe and Asia that were beyond the reach of American censorship. The international attention would make it impossible to completely suppress the story, though the full scope of the facility network might remain classified for decades. As medical helicopters prepared to separate the survivors, Marcus and Emma grabbed Chen's hands with desperate strength, their eyes conveying gratitude and terror in equal measure. They understood that their ordeal was far from over. The psychological rehabilitation would take years, and they would face pressure to remain silent about experiences that challenged fundamental assumptions about human rights and government. Accountability. The storm began to clear as the helicopters lifted off, revealing a landscape that looked deceptively normal after the horrors that had been hidden beneath its surface. Chen watched Devil's Throat disappear behind the mountains, knowing that dozens of other facilities continued operating in remote locations across the country, holding thousands of people whose families still hoped for their safe return. Had they saved Marcus and Emma, or simply transferred them from one form of captivity to another? 6 months after the Devil's Throat incident, the world had largely moved on, but the ripple effects continued to spread through intelligence agencies, government corridors, and families of the missing across the globe. Chen sat in a secure briefing room in Washington, D.C., surrounded by documents that represented the dismantled remnants of a conspiracy that had operated for over 50 years. Beneath America's most pristine wilderness areas, the international pressure generated by Foster's leaked footage had forced a limited investigation that confirmed the existence of 12 similar facilities across the national park system. Congressional hearings had revealed connections to military, research programs, pharmaceutical trials, and psychological warfare studies that stretched back to the Cold War era. Hundreds of missing persons cases had been quietly reopened as families learned that their loved ones might still be alive in government custody. Marcus and Emma Holloway had spent months in rehabilitation facilities that were themselves under scrutiny for connections to the original research programs. Their recovery was complicated by the need to deprogram years of psychological conditioning while helping them testify about experiences that most people couldn't comprehend. Emma's artistic abilities had returned gradually, but her photography now focused exclusively on documenting the sterile walls and artificial lighting of medical facilities. Dr. Vance and most of the facility staff had vanished into witness protection, programs or classified relocations that put them beyond the reach of criminal prosecution. The official investigation had been limited to middle management personnel who could be sacrificed without exposing the full scope of government involvement. The deeper the investigation tried to dig, the more it encountered national security classifications that blocked access to crucial evidence. Foster's technical analysis had revealed that the facility network was just one component of a larger program that included urban surveillance systems, behavioral research projects, and pharmaceutical trials that used homeless populations and undocumented immigrants as test subjects. The scope of human rights violations was so extensive that full disclosure would have destabilized multiple government agencies and international relationships. The Holloway family reunion had been photographed extensively for media outlets, but the carefully staged images couldn't capture the profound trauma that marked every interaction between parents and children who had been separated for 12 years. David and Linda had aged decades in the months since their children's return, struggling to reconcile their joy at the reunion with their horror at what had been done to Marcus and Emma. Morrison and Santos had been reassigned to different departments after receiving commendations for their role in the rescue operation. The official reports praised their bravery, while omitting most details about what they had actually discovered beneath Devil's Throat. Both officers struggled with PTSD related to their knowledge of ongoing human rights violations that they were powerless to prevent or expose. Chen's investigation had uncovered evidence of similar programs in other countries, suggesting that the facility network was part of international cooperation between intelligence agencies that shared research, data and techniques for managing civilian populations. The implications extended far beyond American national parks to wilderness areas worldwide where people disappeared without adequate investigation or follow-up. The legal proceedings had been frustratingly limited, with most cases settled through sealed agreements that provided financial compensation to families in exchange for silence about the circumstances of their loved ones' disappearances. The government's strategy was containment rather than accountability, minimizing public awareness while maintaining the infrastructure necessary to continue modified versions of the research programs. Nevertheless, some victories had been achieved. International human rights organizations now monitored missing persons reports more carefully, and wilderness safety protocols had been strengthened to make unauthorized detentions more difficult. Media attention had forced greater transparency in government research programs, though the most sensitive projects had simply moved to private contractors operating in countries with fewer oversight requirements. Chen received regular updates on Marcus and Emma's progress, watching as two people struggled to rebuild identities that had been systematically destroyed by scientific curiosity disguised as national security research. Their survival was a testament to human resilience, but it also served as evidence of the ongoing capacity for institutional cruelty that operated behind the facade of democratic government. What other secrets lay buried beneath the surface of a society that claimed to value individual freedom above all else? 2 years had passed since Detective Sarah Chen first received that 3:47 a.m. notification that changed everything. She stood, now at the rim of Devil's Throat, watching as morning light slowly crept down the canyon walls toward depths that had been permanently sealed with concrete and steel. The official memorial plaque spoke of a geological disaster that had claimed the lives of several hikers, making no mention of the human experimentation facility that had operated below for decades. The media storm had eventually died down, replaced by newer scandals and more immediate crises that captured public attention. Most people remembered the Devil's Throat incident as a tragic hiking accident with some confusing allegations about government cover-ups that had never been satisfactorily resolved. The families who knew the truth had largely retreated into private grief, exhausted by legal battles that seemed designed to wear down their determination to seek justice. Marcus and Emma Holloway had made remarkable progress in their recovery, though they would never fully escape the psychological scars left by 12 years of captivity. Marcus had returned to software engineering, channeling his analytical mind into developing security systems designed to prevent the kind of surveillance that had enabled his imprisonment. Emma's photography had evolved into powerful documentary, work that exposed human rights violations around the world. Her artistic vision sharpened by intimate knowledge of institutional cruelty. The Holloway family had moved away from Montana, seeking anonymity in a place where they weren't constantly reminded of their ordeal. Their new home was carefully chosen for its distance from national parks and wilderness areas, though Emma still woke screaming from dreams about artificial mountains and endless photograph sorting. The simple act of hiking had become impossible. For both siblings, their love of the outdoors poisoned by memories of how that passion had been weaponized against them. Chen's investigation had continued in unofficial channels, tracking missing persons reports that suggested similar facilities, remained active in other locations. Her work had become a private obsession that cost her marriage and nearly ended her career. But she couldn't abandon the hundreds of families who still waited for loved ones who might be trapped in underground laboratories. The phone calls came regularly, desperate voices asking if she had any information about missing hikers, campers, and adventure seekers who had vanished without trace. Foster had parlayed her technical expertise and international recognition into a consulting business that helped law enforcement agencies identify surveillance networks and hidden facilities. Her work frequently took her to remote locations where she used ground-penetrating radar and other specialized equipment to search for underground installations. The discoveries were always classified immediately, but she maintained private records that suggested the facility network had been reduced but not eliminated. Morrison and Santos had both left law enforcement entirely, unable to continue working within systems they now understood were compromised by the same agencies that had operated the research facilities. Morrison worked as a private investigator, specializing in missing persons cases, while Santos had become a wilderness guide who taught survival skills to people who wanted to explore remote areas safely. Both carried weapons and communication equipment far beyond what their new jobs required. The official investigations had concluded with token prosecutions of mid-level personnel who had been selected as scapegoats, while the architects of the EE program disappeared into classified relocations or comfortable retirements. Congressional hearings had produced thousands of pages of testimony that were immediately sealed under national security provisions, ensuring that the full scope of the human experimentation network would remain hidden from public scrutiny for decades. Yet the work continued in different forms. International human rights organizations maintained databases of disappearances in wilderness areas, and volunteer networks of families shared information about missing loved ones who might still be alive in government custody. The Internet had provided new tools for organizing resistance to institutional secrecy, though it had also enabled more sophisticated surveillance of those who asked too many questions about sensitive topics. Chen's radio crackled with a familiar sound as she prepared to leave Devil's Throat. Another missing persons report, another family desperately seeking answers about a loved one who had vanished during what should have been a routine camping trip. The voice described a college student who had disappeared 3 days earlier in Olympic National Park, leaving behind a tent, backpack, and vehicle, but no trace of where she had gone. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for, but the investigation would follow the same predictable course. Initial searches would find no evidence. The case would be classified as a wilderness accident after the statutory waiting period, and another family would be left with nothing but questions and fading hope. Somewhere in the depths beneath another national park, a new subject would begin adapting to artificial environments designed to break down their sense of reality and individual identity. Chen climbed into her vehicle and drove away from Devil's Throat, knowing she would return to investigate other disappearances in other wilderness areas where the government maintained facilities that officially didn't exist. The work was dangerous and largely futile, but it was also necessary. Someone had to bear witness to the victims of programs that operated beyond public accountability, and someone had to keep searching for the missing who might still be saved. In the end, the greatest tragedy wasn't just what had been done to Marcus and Emma Holloway and thousands of others like them. It was the realization that in a democracy founded on individual liberty, the capacity for systematic human exploitation could operate for generations without meaningful oversight or consequence, hidden beneath the natural beauty of landscapes that most people associated with freedom and adventure. The wilderness kept its secrets, but those who listened carefully could still hear the echoes of voices calling for help from places that maps claimed didn't exist. If this story left you as impacted as it did me, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one. The truth is out there, waiting, in the shadows of our most beautiful places, and only by refusing to look away can we hope to bring it into the light.